Today, 2 weeks to save the banking system. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where I've noticed post covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, Martin.
How are you going?
Well, I'm going really well. Better than the banking system, especially the global banking system. My goodness.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing at the moment what's going on. Of course, Credit Suisse is looking pretty shaky. But, you know, the fact is this move in the interest rates, particularly bond rates, will have a fallout effect across the banking system. And very few people get how significant this is and why this is not just a few bad apples in the banking bin, right? This is a fundamental structural question now relating to the way that banking is going to work.
Yeah, and I think also my observation is it is the lawful consequence and continuation of the bailout approach they took after 2008. In our view, you know, we watched the way this neoliberal financial system evolved to be able to turn into a financial system that, instead of helping the economy grow and making its money that way, started cannibalizing the economy, looting profits, and getting into more and more crazy forms of making profits that was completely unproductive, like through derivatives gambling. That all came crashing down in 2008. But instead of the powers that be stepping in and completely reorganizing the banking system because they recognized that everything that allowed it to turn into was a disaster, and going back to policies like Glass-Steagall that said if you're a bank with deposits, that is a bank that's supposed to serve the real economy, you cannot have anything to do with speculation. That is just this parasite on the real economy. Instead of doing that, they took the prop-up approach. And that was all forms of bailout, including this exotic form of bailout, bail-in, and printing money, re-inflating bubbles, kicking the can down the road. And so now we're seeing a particular crisis in the banks that is directly caused by the response to the inflation that was caused by the money printing. So they printed the money, caused the inflation. The response to the inflation has been to raise interest rates, and that makes the bonds that were part of the money printing at virtually zero interest, that makes them the problem now. Instead of being the security in the system, they are the detonator of the system. And this is all it's 15 years later, but this is all a consequence of not solving the problem back in 2008. So we need to talk about the actual structural systemic reform that should have been done all along to save a banking system so that we can have a banking system that actually serves people. Hence today's discussion, because of course we have a foundation policy to do that, which would be a national bank in the form of a postal bank.
Yeah, and it's pretty remarkable, isn't it, when you think what's happened in the US is that they are now underwriting all of the deposits in the whole of the banking system effectively, right, directly or indirectly. And they've created this term funding facility, which basically allows people in the banking system to show their bonds at par rather than actually at their true value. So they're absolutely masking the weaknesses in the banking system and the weaknesses in the banks. And this is another example where, you know, there's massive desperation amongst central bankers and the treasury operations around the world. But nobody actually wants to take the obvious real step, which is to give banks back to the people.
No, they don't want to do that because at their core, they're ideological. And it's a question of power, right? The history of Australia for a century was the history of the Labor Party fighting for a national bank, a people's bank, and their enemy, as they called it, was the money power. And the question was, who was going to control the money power? Was it going to be purely a private banking oligarchy with all the connections thereof, including international connections back to London, etc., or was it going to be the people controlling the money power? And every country has had a variation of this fight. The great William Gladstone, British Prime Minister in the 19th century, who set up the world's first postal bank, he had to fight. He said, "I fought the money power." He said the bruising he took over setting up Britain's postal bank was, he said the quote is something like, this is a close paraphrase, my memory's not that bad. He goes, the hinge of the whole situation was this: the government was not to be a substantial player in matters of finance, so the money power could remain supreme and unquestioned. In other words, above democracy, right? And that's these people who, they know the power of banking, the power of money. And if governments, and if it's subjected to democratic control, then, they don't like that, right? They want to have that control because that gives them power, not just over the private sector of the economy, it gives them power over government. There's one power that can dictate the government. That's the people governments have to borrow money from. But if the governments have to have their own bank, right, that can do the important things the governments have to do financially, like invest in infrastructure, then the money power has no power over them. And that's why it's such a big fight. And yeah, we our party in this camp, we're part of the campaign to bring that back because it's a fundamental issue about what the world should look like going forward.
And of course, the regional banking inquiry is the linchpin of this at the moment. So it's been running for a little while now, and there are 120 something submissions already up. It's worth reading them, actually. Some really, really good submissions from all sorts of people. But the way to the argument is clearly that banks are actually leaving people in the lurch in regional areas and beyond. And it's quite interesting, the first hearing in Sale, that's pretty astonishing what the banks admitted there, which was that they didn't really communicate. They also didn't really care about the regional communities. They have this agenda, they're just prosecuting it. And interestingly, of course, some of the political class still don't see this as a critical issue, but it really is. And I'm pleased to see that a lot of senators across the aisle are really now up in the ante.
Well, so I'd like to talk about that, but just to emphasize why we chose the title we did, because this consultation phase of the inquiry through submissions is all important. So it's really great there's 125 up, and that means they've got a lot more submissions than that. That's just the ones they've processed, and they're proactively processing them, which is really great as well. But we need to make sure this inquiry has lots of submissions. And I recommend two types of submissions, but we've got 2 weeks to get them in. That's the urgency here. So hence the reason you and I are having this show, even though I thought you were out of action because of all the packing up to go to the UK. So thanks for taking the time, Martin. Because we need to make sure all the viewers of this show who are regulars and have followed this issue, you are part of the success that we've had here in getting this inquiry up and helping to make it successful. But an important part of that is staying engaged and participating at all levels, including in the form of a submission. So what I want to recommend before we get into the specifics of reporting what's happened so far, we'll have the details below. Make sure you make your own submission, and it can be as big or as little as you like. It doesn't really matter, right? But because what you're doing is getting the attention of the body politic of Parliament House with these submissions. And volume, numbers is really, really important, right? So even if you've only got time to jot down a few paragraphs on paper, please do it, or in an email, and email it in. It might just be accepted as correspondence, but that's fine. The senators know that this is generating a lot of engagement out there. So that's really important. The other thing that's important is getting the message out to make sure all the local institutions in your area are also aware of this, especially if you live in a regional area. But don't limit yourself. If you think you're in a city, you don't have a right to have a say here. You absolutely do have a right to have a say. So all the people that, when those, where I live in Glenroy here in Melbourne, there's a shopping strip. These shopping strips are everywhere, not a big shopping centre, just a strip. And usually the strip had the Woolworths, the bank, the butcher, the fruit and veg store, etc., right? And now the bank's gone. And this has happened everywhere. And I found on Facebook the other day, because I have to confess, back in 2019 when it happened, I wasn't paying that close attention. I found on Facebook the other day, someone posted photos of protests in the cities of bank closures, and one of them was my local strip. And who was protesting? All these little old Italian nonnas, etc., right, who needed that bank because they would walk to the shops, go to their banking, go to their shopping, and now that's all gone. So they don't live in the regions. They live in Glenroy and Melbourne, but those people are affected. And I would, in my wildest dreams, I would love all of them to make some kind of a submission here. Absolutely, if they're the ones in the regional areas, though, right? So someone's got to get the message to them. So we put, and we'll make sure this is below. We put the various types of ways you can make a submission. You can upload a submission on the Parliament's portal. You can email a submission, or you can handwrite and post one in. And I'm really concerned, Martin, that we need to get the message out to the people who don't watch YouTube videos. And that's why I'm appealing to the people watching this one. You know those people who don't watch YouTube videos, who don't use email, who have lovely handwriting, right? Who get affected. They're the most affected by these branch closures. Please tell them, really urge them, make a submission, write a letter to this committee, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it in, because that will have a huge impact. And we've basically got 2 weeks to do this. Now, if more come in after the deadline, the committee will accept it. That's not a problem. But it's it's not a totally open-ended process. So you have to mobilize. So we want to use these last 2 weeks to really mobilize. So please, you, the viewer now watching this, your personal role here is very important in both making a submission and getting the word out to make sure lots of people make submissions, and lots of organizations make submissions. Lots, local businesses that are affected, or the RSLs, the charities, the St. Vincent's de Paul's, all these sort of things in these towns. Tell them they've all got an opportunity here to make a submission. And then in terms of the two types of submission, which I think it's very, very important, and we can elaborate on this. Make a submission on either one or both subjects. One being the impact that comes from branches being closed down. The other being the solution, if you've been following our campaign for a postal bank, the postal bank solution. And you making a submission saying you support the postal bank solution is going to help force this inquiry, because it's got it in the terms of reference, consideration of solutions, to even potentially hold hearings on the postal bank solution. And then we're getting really, really serious. The banks are already upset this inquiry is happening. But if they see hearings where the senators seriously look at a government bank operating through post offices that will not therefore just serve the bank's own existing customers, but will steal the bank's customers off them, then we're at war. And I want to be in that war. This will be a war in public, where the public will get to decide between the big four bastard banks and a people's bank. And I know who's going to win that public war. Absolutely 100% in the battle for the hearts and minds of the public. That's what we want. And you can help that process by making sure your submission endorses the call for a public postal bank.
Yeah, and it's just worth underscoring, isn't it, that the whole rationale here is that banks should be to support local communities and local businesses and enable them to be successful where they are. And we know that when banks disappear, then the commercial heart of those communities disappear. And whilst there is always the digital alternative, and some people will use it, some people won't, it's not very good when the power goes out. And I was very interested that Adrian Orr, the guy who runs the RBNZ, made the point the other day, following the cyclone up in the Northern Isle part of New Zealand, was that branches and cash were actually critical because that's all they had. And that's a really interesting when a banker says, we've got to make sure that we actually have these, because without it, you don't actually have any commercial activity. But also, there's also issues about community and social cohesion as well. I thought that was a really interesting contribution.
Well, you know what the real headline is from that? The Reserve, if people interpreted these things properly, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Governor Adrian Orr is attacking the Australian banking system and the Australian government, because everything that he said is essential for social cohesion from cash, our government is allowing our banks to totally trash it, completely trash it. And now's a good time to update people briefly, Martin, on the case of our mutual friend Paul Thomas, because we put out a release about this yesterday. Paul Thomas, a couple of weeks ago, was sent a letter in February from NAB saying they were debanking him. And this is after he was debanked by Westpac in 2020. And why? Because Paul has a cash in transit business. It's called Commander Securities. It's a small competitor to Armaguard, etc. But when he was debanked by Westpac in 2020, it was part of a wave of debanking that Westpac did of all sorts of companies involved in handling and processing and transporting cash, including these cash remittance companies that are in sort of like, there's a lot of them in the western suburbs of Sydney, and they help people in Australia's ethnic communities remit cash back to their families in the countries they come from. And they do it, frankly, really efficiently and much cheaper than the banks do it. And Westpac and all the banks went and debanked them en masse. So they can't operate, they don't have bank accounts to operate with. This happened to Paul as well. And he's a cash and transit guy. And that was, Paul was someone who came around our campaign against the cash ban. And of course, we defeated the bill to ban cash transactions. But what's happened is the banks have gone, seeing that we defeated that bill, and used their private power to ram through the reduction of cash in different ways as well, including by targeting these sort of businesses. So he moved from Westpac to NAB. Now NAB has debanked him, but that's not the worst bit. On Friday, the 24th of February, suddenly, without notice, Paul can't log into his digital banking for like NAB's mobile online banking. Now think about this. The banks like NAB are telling us, not just go digital, they're telling us you want to go digital. Hey, look at you're feeling sleepy, you want to go digital. So they are pushing us into digital banking, right? And then with absolute no warning, they just turned it off on a Friday. Paul was cut off from his bank account for 4 days. He went out of his mind, already reeling from being informed. And now it was a mistake. They turned it back on after 4 days, but it wasn't a mistake, just a random mistake. It was because he's on the list to be debanked. Whoever has that power to cut you off from online banking, and hello, people know that someone has the power to do that, did it a bit prematurely, right? And didn't realize that he still had half a month left to go on the notice, the 30 days notice they'd given him. That's enormous power. If you only have digital banking, you have given the banks enormous power over you, enormous. And that's why we need to make sure absolutely that there are alternatives to digital banking with the big four banks. And there's two types of alternatives. One is cash. We must never let the banks get rid of cash in the economy, ever. This is a hill to die on. They must never be allowed to do it, ever. A country like Australia, we're big and spread out and, bad internet connectivity. Of course, we shouldn't do it. No country should do it. No country should force people to give up cash. It should always have a role, first thing. And the second type of alternative is a true alternative to those big four banks. You got a lot of peripheral minor customer-owned banks. They're great, but they aren't really competition with the big four banks. They're the people that just they're the institutions that come along and feed off the crumbs that fall off the big four banks table. You want an alternative that can match them. And that's a postal bank. That's a government-owned bank that starts and is straight away the biggest retail bank in Australia because it operates through every post office in Australia. That's what you want. And then because it's government-owned and it's not there to screw people and it's not there to maximize its profit and it's not there to steal, to get rid of cash, etc. It's there for service. It'll make a profit doing it, but it's there for service. Then that's what will keep people safe in the financial system. Always have a port in a storm, if you will. Always have an alternative to the power of the big four banks. And by being that alternative, it'll very much constrain the power of the big four banks.
Absolutely, and there's a cultural thing here, isn't there? That the big four banks, in theory, have a social license, but in practice they ignore it. And what a government-backed bank would be effectively a stake in the ground to say this is the way that banking is, this is the culture that actually is required. and essentially they will have to compete on that basis. So it is not only shifting the dial in terms of accountability, responsibility, but culturally as well, and effectively it can really reset the way that banking works across the country. And I think that's the critical issue that we need to focus, because they've had a go over the last few years. They've clearly let everybody down. They don't care about it. They're only there to maximise their return to shareholders and to farm, the profitable bit of banking to the benefit of their shareholders. But there's nothing there about corporate responsibility, nothing there about social license, nothing there about the obligations to the businesses and households across Australia that need banking and need banking to be there and, actually at a reasonable price and a reasonable, accessible service level.
And now let me give people some encouragement, Martin, because look, this campaign is really coming together. And so, people need to know that and be enthusiastic about staying engaged, because a couple of things have happened. So first of all, we got the inquiry up, and, we've talked about that. And of course, your letter, authored with Dale Webster, was really crucial in getting this committee, the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee, to agree to conduct an inquiry. What I got to go to the first hearing at Sale. It was brilliant. And what that showed me, a couple of things, but one of the most important things is the committee itself is now fully engaged in this issue, because it took the hearing for them, like they were, they saw there was a groundswell of support for this inquiry, but every senator has a whole heap of demands on their time, right? And lots of different people lobbying them, lots of different things. This is just one of their issues. But they got to see in Technicolor, if they had any doubts at that hearing, just how crucial this issue was. And I saw them engage. I saw them unify. They represented all the different parties there. One Nation, Greens, Labor, Liberal, National. I saw them unify, right? They were all on the same page. And what unified them, of course, was the arrogance of the banks, the attitude of the banks, right? Because it was totally, completely unacceptable. And that tells me we've now got a tiger by the tail, because the other factor was the actual community itself. The people and institutions of Sale turned up, and I've been ranting on about this for a long time. If Anna Bligh, the CEO of the Banking Association, was telling the truth, that the banks are following us, we the consumer, are setting the direction here, because we're the ones who want to go digital, right? And the banks are just coming in behind us. If that's what's defining this, then this campaign wouldn't exist. This inquiry wouldn't exist. And that damn hearing wouldn't have happened, I can tell you, because the people of Sale turned up and representatives of the local towns, and they were unequivocal, unapologetic in their attack on the banks and their demand for banking services and cash, especially cash, out in their regions. Totally unapologetic about that. This is a real protest. Right. So that all came together in the hearing. And so I'm watching the lights come on in these senators' eyes. Right. And now they've got a 10-month hearing, and they know their names will be attached to a really, really big deal here. Right. And so a lot can come of that. But it's going to require the constant engagement. And then just I have to comment on the attitude of the banks. It was like, so there's two banks represented, Westpac and NAB. We'll deal with NAB first. I mean, the people from NAB, especially the NAB main spokeswoman, Chrissy Jones, she had ice in her veins. I mean, this woman was hard. She had a hard edge. Nothing would shame her. So, but she spoke second. What you could at least have to acknowledge with the Westpac guys is the poor Westpac guy. He was getting redder and redder as he kept having to answer more questions. He at least knew that how awful what he was saying out loud sounded. You could tell. So what had been sounding great for them for the last few years, sitting around their boardroom, probably smoking cigars and flicking the ash off their pinstripe suits, about the total killing they're going to make profit-wise by being able to close all these branches and make everyone digital. And they would have been guffawing and backslapping and knocking back brandies and whatever and thinking this is the greatest revolution in banking ever, and they were able to be part of it, right? And it sounded so great. He had to repeat the decisions of that kind of environment out in public in front of the victims, and he knew it sounded awful. Absolutely awful. Just basic stuff. Matt Canavan opens up and says, how did you consult with the community? How did they consult? They sent them an email after they'd made the decision to close. And Matt Canavan said, can we agree on what the word consult means? Right? This is the English language after all. And it just went downhill for the banks from there. And so that kind of, now, the banks, they're not going to be keen to change. They're absolutely not. One public shaming isn't going to be enough. But what it's going to do is reflect back on what we're putting up as the alternative, because it's only the alternative that's going to force them to change. If they realize they have to compete with a public option. So all that came together at the hearing. And then the other thing was we caught them out, and there's going to be an article about this, but I'll just mention this briefly. The town of Maffra it has a NAB agency. And the day before the hearing, Anna Bligh held the town of Maffra up as an example of, Anna Bligh said the town of Maffra's deposits, that is the number of transactions depositing money, have dropped by something like 80% in 12 months. And then the NAB executive said, look, you got to understand, all we're doing is following the customers to where they are. And I thought she was referring to digital, and she wasn't. She was basically saying towns like Maffra show the customers are going and doing all their shopping in the next biggest town, and so we're going to those towns to be where they are. That's why we're closing these smaller branches. But Martin, this is a total inversion of what we know to be the truth. It's the bank moving first that forces the customers in those towns to have to go to the next town and follow it. NAB's trying to flip it and claim that they're following, right? And Maffra was this example. But what don't they say? They don't say that in 2022, the year they're talking about, they cut Maffra's hours back to 3 days a week and not full days at that. And they also don't say that as of September 2022, because they haven't been able to get staff, the doors of the Maffra branch of NAB have not opened since it for 1/3 or 1/4 of the year. The doors, more than 1/4 of the year, the doors didn't open. And so when they're saying there's been an 80% drop in deposits, yeah, because the banks never open for people to go and do drop their deposits in. But they don't provide that context. That would be a more interesting, nuanced conversation if they did. They don't want to. They want to lie to people. And the NAB, one of the NAB execs was asked straight out, is the branch still open? And he said, yes. Whereas the locals say, no, it's not. It's closed. Right? And this is actually misleading Parliament. So there's going to be consequences for this. And it's that kind of sheer arrogance that's going to get these senators more and more fired up. And that's just an example of this being a big process. And can I say just quickly, because we don't want to take too long, but the other point that's come together at the same time is the day before the hearing in Sale on the 2nd of March, the Albanese government, the Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland, announced a review of Australia Post. And what's that about? Australia Post is projecting a loss this year. Their half-year result was much smaller. There was an 80% drop from the half-year of the year before, and they're projecting a loss. And Australia Post is required to operate commercially at a profit. And the constraints on Australia Post operating commercially, it has these two community service obligations. One is the mail delivery every day, and the other one is the number of post offices in Australia. That's set by law. And so all this will now be reviewed in this Australia Post review. Now, think if the government goes down the path, they're claiming they won't go down the path of privatisation. I can tell you the LPO group is very suspicious. But if they go down the path of revising these community service obligations and even allowing post offices to close, how much of a massive double blow is that for regional Australia if they're losing branches and post offices, right? That would be just gut regional Australia. What are we offering? We are offering the ultimate win-win solution. Our policy will save face-to-face banking services for every community in Australia by making sure the post office is a branch of a bank, and will save every post office in Australia. It is the definition of win-win. Only one entity, one sector would be unhappy with this policy. One. And that is those fat cat bastards in those big four banks. And if this bloody government guts services in regional Australia because it doesn't want to take on the fight against those fat cat bastards in those big four banks, when there's such an obvious win-win solution, you, the people, must fire up. You must, they've got to go. Like, it's not just, it's not the Labor got to go, the system's got to go, right? Or we force them to do this. This is not negotiable. They must go down this path. The existence of a functional society in most of Australia is at stake if they don't. If you just let them keep letting services go because they're stuck to their neoliberal insanity, rather than taking a solution that is so obvious because there's a government role in it, right? Then we deserve as a nation, we deserve everything we've got coming to us. We will be committing a form of national economic suicide, and it will be suicide by our own hands. Sheer insanity. There's so much at stake, and we have the perfect win-win solution. And now, this is going to become an undeniable issue for the rest of the year. And the fact the Australia Post review, 2 months of submissions to that, is happening at the same time as the submission process for the regional banking inquiry. Both things can be can come together, and people start saying, hey, there's a solution here. And the good news is the union that represents postal workers has already saddled up and said so. So the union said, look, we need to go down, expand banking services and have a bank that can force the big four to compete, because that's what will save Australia Post. That's the postal union. The LPO group is saying the same thing. They're the ones who represent the small business post office operators. They're huge allies of us in the campaign for a postal bank. They're all speaking up now, and that the coming together of the two issues is beautiful.
Yeah, and it's worth just underscoring that despite what the big banks have said about the substitution that you can get going online and using the bank at post services in the post office, we've seen spreadsheets that show less than half of the available services in a typical branch would be available through those solutions. And that's another example of the BS that's around here. And, you know, the very, very bad story that the banks are propagating and Anna Bligh is propagating. There is no substitution at the moment available for a lot of the services that people need. And yet, if you had a government-backed or post-bank, that would actually solve the problem, keep the communities and businesses alive in those regional areas, and also provide a significant economic driver more broadly to the economy. And that's the final point to highlight here. This isn't just about saving banking in regional Australia. This is a fundamental change to the economic structure of the way that Australia works, because we can now invest and build for the future. Whereas, of course, at the moment, the banks, the big four particularly, just want to lend people more money for more houses and inflate the housing market and not do their true job, which is to be the economic dynamo to drive the economic future of the country.
We've got loans. If we've got a bank that's operating through every post office, and there's an increase in loans flowing back into regional Australia, a significant increase, because it deserves it. The private banks have virtually cut them off. Right, there's no credit going out there. Robbie Catter up in Queensland, he's screaming about this. You know, even home loans in Western Queensland, you've got to have like a 40 or even 60% deposit to qualify for a home loan, because the banks don't want to lend out there. This will change with our bank, right? And you get that credit flowing out in those areas, immensely productive areas of Australia, and Australia's true potential can start to be realised. And what you're also doing is taking the economic, the concentration of where the economy, and all the wealth is, out of the property bubble and into more productive areas. And it's totally transformative. So the solution's there. The role, though, this has all been people driven from the get-go. 100%. This is a people's bank that we're fighting for. This is people's services that we're fighting for. This is for the people. And so you watching this are a people. You're a person. You are the people that are watching this, and you got 14 days or 15 days to make a very, very important submission to this process.
Yeah, Robbie, well, thanks very much. And I've certainly enjoyed the campaigns that we've been involved in recent years. And whilst I'm going across the UK now, I'm still going to be very focused on Australia. And I look forward to having our next conversation when I'm over the other side of the world. And by the way, there's some interesting synergies because there are interesting battles going on over there as well with regards to how banking works. So maybe there's a win-win there as well.
I think so. I'm familiar with a lot of that. It's a very similar issue, except it's a much tinier place. But that's the only predicate that I can see that's really different. It's the same essential issue. So I think this will be a fight we can expand globally, Martin, thanks to you being over there. And I like getting up very early in the morning, so I'm sure we'll be able to find time to have lots of conversations. I was gonna get all sentimental. And I was going to try and find the video. The first time I ever saw you on video, but I'll just mention it. People can find it on Walk the World. If you go back to the week of February 14, 2018, a few days after the February 14th, there's a video that you put up on bail-in, and that's what people were sending to us because you were outside of us. You were the first person of any kind of standing to really report this. And that's when I thought, I better get in touch with this guy. And ever since, we've run lots and lots of campaigns together, all on the same theme, basically cleaning up the both the corruption and the structural failings of the banking system. And we've certainly educated a lot of people along the way. But I feel we've never been closer to actually success on one of our campaigns than this one. Right, and if we get that success, a lot of things can fall into place, and other countries will, like the UK, will be very interested in what Australia does, and maybe we can get some success over there that Australia would like to copy. So I think the future's looking bright. But thank you very much for your collaboration over the last 5 years. It's been exceptional.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. Well, it's not over yet. I'll see you on the other side, and we'll keep batting because, of course, banking is too important to be left to the bankers and the politicians.
That's right. 100%. 100%. Here.
See you, Robbie.
Thanks,
Thank you. Bye-bye.